I am Lucinda Curran, your host for the Environmental Sensitivities Symposium, a world-first event. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing you to Nicole Bijlsma. Hello, Nicole, how are you?
Hi, Lucinda, I'm well, thank you.
We might start talking straight away about the sort of work that you do. Could you tell us, please?
Sure, well, I'm a building biologist, which essentially means I go in and conduct audits of people's buildings to determine if there are health hazards that are making them unwell. So that can include everything from electromagnetic fields, AC magnetic fields, and radio frequency, from wireless technology to things like allergens, pollen, fungi, and house dust mite, other things like chemicals in building materials, teaching them about how to assess chemicals in household products and also how to build a healthy home. So any way in which the building can affect people's health, of course other things like drinking water quality, etc. So my primary target are children with neurobehavioural disorders, autism, dyslexia, learning disorders, but also people with asthma and allergies.
It's an incredible array of things, and you also run a college. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
I began the Australian College of Environmental Studies in 1999 as a result of a need to educate people about the health hazards in the built environment. And that came about as a result of two things. Firstly, noticing a very strong connection between many of my patients' illnesses and their homes. I was working as a naturopath and acupuncturist for 15 years, and I noticed a lot of clients with chronic fatigue syndrome would comment about their visible mold that they could see in their home and wondered if there was a connection. I also found a lot of people with insomnia would often have an electromagnetic field source within a metre of their head, and I thought that was an interesting coincidence. But it wasn't until I moved into our own home, our first home that we bought, that really came home to me how the environment can affect people's health. And basically what happened, we moved into this lovely home, and within days we gradually developed insomnia and didn't think that it was connected. After 12 months, had my first miscarriage, then had 10 miscarriages in this space, and started to think about what on earth was going on, and no one was able to assist us to determine why I was miscarrying so often. A reproductive immunologist was able to pick up that something had triggered my immune response, and I started to look at the house because it all happened since we moved there, and lo and behold, we're sleeping on the other side of the wall of the meter box, which generates a high AC magnetic field. In that time, two important studies came out in 2002 on miscarriage rates and exposure to AC magnetic fields beyond 15 milligauss, and when I measured it, we were in excess of 30 milligauss, sometimes over 500 milligauss, depending on how many appliances were being used at the time. So it started to make me think about what was in our home and how it was affecting us. So we relocated to another bedroom. I then fell pregnant with twins, and the rest is history.
And it's a wonderful history too, because you've now got 3 children.
I do. So with the twin pregnancy, the reproductive immunologist in the US was able to determine what course of treatment for me to take to dampen my immune response. When I got pregnant with Charlotte, we'd already moved to another home, and I checked for mold, EMFs, etc. And when I got pregnant again, I went to undergo that course of treatment, but couldn't afford it because it had gone up by 50,000 Australian dollars, which was just not viable for us. And lo and behold, it wasn't a problem. I didn't have any treatment and successfully gave birth to Charlotte without any intervention. And we were in a completely different home, so it was an interesting history of events.
It's quite amazing because I know the number of people who get IVF and that have difficulty becoming pregnant. I would imagine it's rising significantly at the moment. I don't have the statistics, but I know the incidence is just getting more and more from my experience and what I see. I would think, too, that given the training I've done, which is with you, that would be a significant part of what's going on for everybody else.
Absolutely. And look, I think the big player here that is emerging in the scientific literature is the role of endocrine disrupting chemicals and their impact on fertility. In fact, I used to joke about it 20 years ago at university when I was lecturing that it won't be a nuclear bomb that wipes us out, it'll be infertility from the chemicals that we've released into our everyday products since World War II. And unfortunately, that looks like being closer to the truth than I'd ever imagined 20 years back. We have almost 1,000 potential endocrine disrupting chemicals now in general circulation through household products and building materials, and we know that they can have significant impacts when an unborn fetus is exposed to these chemicals early on, particularly by week 7. It can have profound impacts on that child's fertility. The risk of genital malformations increases 400%. The risk of testicular cancer in boys, early puberty in girls, increased risk of breast cancer as a result of this. I know we're approaching about 20% infertility rates in most industrial countries. So, yeah, fertility is a huge issue. We know as a naturopath, it's sort of like bread and butter nowadays. When I was practicing up until about 10 years ago, it was chronic fatigue syndrome, and that's still a big issue. But fertility is becoming such a specialised field in naturopathy because there's such a demand for that. And, of course, we see that through IVF as well. I'm sure our children think IVF is where you go to have kids in future, sadly.
It's a bit like the eggs come from the carton in the supermarket.
Exactly.
It's quite distorted that that's really becoming the norm.
Well, exactly. It is a problem, and I'd love to do a whole tape just on endocrine disrupting chemicals. It's part of my next book, actually. I'm writing called 1,000 Ways to Lose Your Fertility, and the title really comes from the fact that there are almost 1,000 potential endocrine disrupting chemicals that we're exposed to, and unfortunately, most of these have short half-lives. Some of them are very persistent in our fat tissues, but because it's so ubiquitous through our cash receipts, our food tins, our plastics, our food packaging, our clothing, our pesticides, our flame retardants, it's just everywhere. So it is having a profound impact on human fertility rates, and I'm sure we'll become much more aware of that as the increase in fertility happens in humans and more epidemiological studies indicate what's going on.
I know a lot of chemicals are recognised now as being endocrine disruptors. Why is it that they're still allowed? Why are they available in our communities?
It's how they're regulated. Our regulation of chemicals is based on Paracelsus, who in the 15th century indicated that it's the dose that determines the toxicity. So basically, the higher the level of chemical you're exposed to, say for example, a herb or pharmaceutical drug, the greater the impact or the greater the incidence of adverse health effects, and it comes to a threshold where adverse health effects occur, and that's why we have exposure standards to say at this level health effects won't occur, but beyond that it will. That's based on the dose determines the toxicity. Endocrine disrupting chemicals do not follow that model. In fact, the lower the level of exposure in an unborn fetus and a child, the greater the impact on the body. And the reason is because hormones work in parts per billion, parts per trillion. So it's like saying 1 drop of gin in 100 train carts of tonic water. And that's the level at which endocrine disrupting chemicals and endogenous opioids work within our body in parts per trillion. So when you introduce something like BPA, even though it might be only 1 part per billion in that infant polycarbonate baby bottle with the infant formula, you'll find that at that level it is sufficient to switch on genes and to alter estrogen production within the body. The big issue here is it seems to be males that are very susceptible to this, and a lot of this research came out from Frederick von Saal, who was like the father of making us aware of BPA, and he indicated with all his rat studies, because rats have short lifespans, he was able to indicate over tens of thousands of rats how endocrine disrupting chemicals can affect the body, and ironically his work is following very closely what's happening in the human population. In the 60s, we thought that rats don't replicate what happens in humans, but in fact, with endocrine disrupting chemicals, his research is showing very clearly the same effects in humans as it did with his rats. So because hormone disrupting chemicals follow non-monotonic responses, i.e., that the lower the level of exposure, the worse the outcome in an unborn fetus and in a child, they do not follow the same principles and rules that traditional chemicals follow. So therefore, the only way that these chemicals can be regulated is actually zero tolerance. And that has only happened with chemicals that are classified as carcinogenic by the International Agency for Research on Cancer. They will not do zero tolerance unless it's a group 1 carcinogen. So unfortunately, this is why we keep rolling out these chemicals. There's so much money to be made in the industry that they'll fight tooth and nail to prevent any form of restriction of these chemicals, because there's no onus on the chemical industry to prove that it's safe before they release it into the general circulation. So our regulation is pretty much, we're not regulated. It's a self-regulatory system. In Australia, for example, it's up to the manufacturer to regulate themselves by complaining about themselves to the ACCC to say, look, we've had a reaction to this chemical by our clients, so we'll tell you that we've had a problem with our own chemical. Who does that? And unfortunately, the Australian government, as a result of this, has said this existing system works because it's self-regulated, and they've had very little reports of people complaining about their own product. And this is the stupidity of the situation we live in. It's ultimately about dividends for shareholders, and that's coming at the cost of human health.
It's really quite absurd, and even just looking at the only negative effect of a chemical is cancer. I mean, if we look at like the loss of lifestyle, the gaining of other health issues, it's much bigger and broader than just that.
Absolutely, definitely. But because it's a reactive approach, manufacturers of that technology, of that chemical, of that product do not have to prove safety. So it gets into the general circulation, it gets onto the market, it stays on for potentially generations as scientists and government agencies try and prove that it's a problem. And of course, as we know, with asbestos, leaded petrol, tobacco, this took generations.
Sure did. The other thing I'd love to touch on now, if that's okay with you, is to talk a little bit about why the government standards are so high for EMF, considering our building biology standards are up to 1 million times lower in some areas.
Yeah, well, the standards for electromagnetic fields, and particularly for radio frequencies used in wireless technology, are so poor in Australia. As you indicated, we actually don't have a health-based standard for long-term exposure to low levels based on non-thermal effects in this country. And even our agencies who regulate this, ARPANSA, Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Authority, acknowledge this, that there is actually no health-based standard. The exposure standards that exist are based on the 100-kilo US military soldier. Now, I don't see a 100-kilo man in my childcare centre or my kindergarten or schools. So these levels are based right at the levels at which you get heating of brain tissue, which is extremely high. Now, the amount of evidence that has come out in the last 5 years particularly has indicated very clearly that non-thermal effects can have a serious impact on the human body, and in particular on children whose skulls are significantly thinner, who are exposed to this technology before birth, right up until old age. In fact, there's a lot of literature that the Chinese and Russians have done on electromagnetic fields and RF that hasn't even been published or translated yet, that we're really waiting for, because particularly Russia, their equivalent to their exposure standards and their regulatory authority are very damning in their concern about adverse health effects arising from wireless technology. I mean, we're talking about a country that tried to ban microwave ovens in 1979. They did a lot of testing in the Cold War, and they have a pretty good perspective on the impact of microwave radiation on human health. So I'm really looking forward to this research from Chinese researchers and the Russians to indicate what they have found in relation to radio frequencies. But Australia's standard is really poor, and the reason is because the government has a vested interest. It has a lot of shares in the telecommunications industry. So if they're acknowledging that there are adverse health effects and they're a major shareholder, then that's a huge conflict to dividends for their shareholders. It's a huge conflict of interest. And it's something that, unfortunately, this is what causes a lot of the health hazards that exist in the built environment.
And the standards are fairly similar to the US and other countries as well. So Europe is quite different. They're a lot lower. China, India, Russia are all lower. But America, UK and Australia are fairly similar.
Yeah, they follow the International Commission for Non-Ionising Radiation Protection in terms of their standards, and that's based on tissue heating effects, so thermal effects on neurological tissue, which we all know is completely outdated. It was 1989, I think, that those standards were set, so well before wireless technology was even introduced into the general population. I think Professor Leonard Hardell's research, though, has really pushed forward the concern about radio frequencies and their relationship to glioma brain tumours. In fact, it was because of this that the World Health Organization classified radio frequencies as a Group 2B, possibly carcinogenic to humans, simply because they could no longer ignore the mounting weight of evidence associating mobile phone use with brain tumour development. So we know if you use a mobile phone on one side of the head for at least half an hour a day, every day for 10 years, your incidence of glioma is increased by 220%. In contrast, if you use a cordless phone on one side of the head for at least half an hour a day for 10 years, your incidence of glioma brain tumours increases by 470%. So, most people don't realise cordless phones are worse. I think they're worse simply because people use them a lot more and they're on them a long time. But they don't tend to see that as a wireless device. So people need to be aware of this and ideally to go back to hardwired cable options wherever possible.
Absolutely. It's so incredible that these things are going on like they are in terms of the electromagnetic fields, chemicals, so many things that affect our health. What do you think, and this is obviously just purely speculation, what is it going to take for the governments, for the standard setters to actually go, you know what, this is way too high?
That's a good question. What is it going to take? It's going to take people power. That's what it's going to take. It's going to get people out in the street. It's going to get people on change.org. It has to happen at the ground level. It has to happen with parents. So many of us all over the world are speaking out. We're writing about it. We're talking about it. And people are, talented people are making videos about it. And this is what it takes to educate people, because ultimately we put those politicians and regulatory authorities into position. So this is what it's going to take, and unfortunately that takes time. Releasing something like wireless technology into the general circulation without testing it before to see what impact it has on human health is ludicrous. But then when we look at chemicals, they do exactly the same thing. I think the fact that the European Commission have introduced the REACH program in 2006 is great, because it's certainly starting to evaluate chemicals and industrial chemicals before they get into the marketplace. But no such system exists in Australia, and certainly doesn't exist when it comes to wireless technology.
Hopefully things will be changing soon, and hopefully even what we're doing now is going to help create a lot of awareness that people can pay attention to and start being active. Everybody, Nicole Bijlsma will be a speaker at the Environmental Sensitivities Symposium. You can find out more at environmentalsensitivityssymposium.com.